Thank you. And as a greedy capitalist, I remind you, I still have one book left to sell. Does anybody have any questions? One belongs to that lady over there. She's, you got a question? I see a hand over here.
I wonder why the term industrial revolution
That's a good question. Why was the term industrial revolution chosen instead of machine revolution? Well, it revolutionized industry and the ability to mass produce consumer goods. It may well be a broader term. I'm just happy that term was chosen because it's an essentially positive term. You know, the revolutionizing of industry and the mass production of consumer goods. I just wish the schools and the universities would teach this in an accurate way rather than in the distorted Marxist, Marxist way that it does. I don't know the answer to the question. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure, that it's would be momentous significance in changing the name. I like Industrial Revolution, anyway. But I do think we need an educational revolution, and my good buddy Brad Thompson, the head of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism at Clemson University, has really put it brilliantly. That the desire to abolish the government schools and to create a free market in education, that makes us the new abolitionists. That we need to abolish government schools in the same way and for the same reason that we abolished slavery, because it's an inhuman horror. It's simply indoctrination. It is simply when you have government schools in a dictatorship, whether it's under National Socialism or communism or whatever, the government, the dictators runs the school system and basically indoctrinates the little kids. When you have government schools in a mixed economy such as ours, what that means is you have pressure groups battling each other to control the government schools and ram, their point of view down the throats of the students, whether it's banning evolution and or teaching creationism, or whether it's indoctrinating the kids that capitalism is evil and socialism is virtuous, or that human industrialization is destroying the environment, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Government schools are a means of indoctrination and not a means of education. So that's what I want to do. Is I want to abolish the government school systems, institute a free market of education in this country, and remember, you harken back to the 18th and early 19th centuries in this country, prior to the imposition of government schools in the mid-19th century, and remember how high the literacy and educational levels were in the United States. Prior to the imposition of government schools, Ted Kennedy, of all people, circa 1990, his office issued a memo that the state of Massachusetts, and guess what state government schools originated in? I'll give you one guess. Yeah, it's Massachusetts, right? How Massachusetts has fallen from, the Revolutionary period, when it was a powder keg, of individual rights and liberty. But Senator Kennedy's office acknowledged that, in 1850, right, just prior to the imposition of government schools, the literacy rates in the state of Massachusetts were 97%, higher than they've ever been since. And just as a few examples of that, Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is, written in plain language, but deals with very sophisticated political principles I'm not sure my college students could understand today. Common Sense was written for the common man, and it's sold, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like, to a free population of 2 million in the colonies, and it sold something like 400,000 copies. The essays of the Federalist, written by, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, very sophisticated political philosophy, were newspaper editorials written for the common man. In the early 19th century, the novels of James Fenimore Cooper and Walter Scott, who, again, I don't think college graduates in the United States today, a lot of them could understand, they sold millions and millions of copies in America to a very small population. So, the literacy levels, Thomas Sowell points out that the McGuffey readers, at a very high intellectual level relative to the equivalent material used in the American schools today. So these were not, as Thomas Sowell points out, these were not the books of the elite, but of the masses. They sold like 120 million copies, in 120 million copies. So it wasn't anywhere near that. The population wasn't anywhere near that. So the literacy levels. The literacy levels of a free market education in the United States were exactly what you would expect. They were very, very high. So there's there are some terms I want to change. I want to the way Ayn Rand wants to reclaim the term selfishness. I want to reclaim the term liberalism. We're the liberals. The supporters of liberty, LIB, the supporters of liberty, of individual rights. The semi-socialist welfare statists are not liberals, they're statists. And the great Chinese philosopher Confucius said a long time ago, see to it that things are called by their right names. See to it that things are called by their right names. This is not just a matter of semantic significance, it's getting the logic of the argument straight. The supporters of individual rights are the liberals. Supporters of semi-socialist welfare state or statists. So there are terms I want to reclaim. I don't see any need to change the Industrial Revolution. But the most important thing is this: if we don't win the battle in the American educational system, then this country's going down the drain. There's no way to save the country. We're going to become a socialist dictatorship, whether of a fascist or communist variety, within the next 50 years, I think. We have to win the battle in the educational system. We have to privatize the school system. We have to abolish the government schools and establish a free market in education. I think the survival of the republic literally depends on it. Was a hand up over here? Someone? Yes, this lady over here. Yeah. Anybody hear the question? About education in America and how the progressives have influenced that. Again, see to it that things are called by their right names. John Dewey and that school are not progressive. They're anything but. They're the regressives. And so how John Dewey and the regressive school, adversely affected education in the United States. Diane Ravitch, has written some really good books on this. She's the leading historian of American education. One of her books, eloquently titled "Left Back." You could read Diane Ravitch on this, but she's not an objectivist. But what emerges from the story is how Dewey, the regressives, and the American educational establishment generally, in one form or another, has warred against the mind. They have given up the idea a long time ago that the purpose of education is to train the mind, and they replaced it with various other beliefs. The purpose of education is to teach a child to express himself, in a subjective way. Or the purpose of education is to learn to conform to society. Or the purpose of education is to develop self-esteem. Or the purpose of education, is to collectivize the individual. Now you focus. The one reason I think that educational systems, even government schools, as bad as they are in other countries, are not as bad as in the United States, is because Dewey and his peers in the regressive movement had an influence in American education beyond what they were able to gain in Europe or Asia. Now, the difference is that the Europeans and Asians are extremely elitist. They train only, the elite. But who they educate much better than we do. But I think, generally. But, don't forget something. The leading regressive educators. Let's go back a little further. Does anybody know the reasons for, since the literacy levels were so high in the United States prior to the imposition of government schools in the mid-19th century, why was there an imposition of government schools? It's not like people were illiterate. Far from it. Anybody know why? Yeah, that's right. That's right. There's two reasons. For one is the influx of Catholics from Ireland who many native-born Protestant Americans believed, would not be loyal to the United States. They're going to be loyal to the Pope, and so the great panacea to that was going to be government-mandated schools using the Protestant Bible. And so there was, notice that there was so much anti-Catholic prejudice in the early days of American government schools, and these Catholic kids forced to use the Bible, that the Catholic, this is the law of unintended consequences. The Catholic bishops mandated that Catholic schools had to be formed to get these kids away from the Protestant indoctrination and the anti-Catholic prejudice in the government schools. And so you saw the establishment in the late 19th century, of this vast network of private Catholic schools to make sure that the Catholic kids weren't brainwashed and indoctrinated in the government schools. But two, maybe even that's bad enough. These are the skeletons in the closet, of the government school system that the socialists don't want us to know. Even worse than that is the influx of German philosophy into the country. Kant and Hegel, eventually Marx. But the idea that your life belongs to the state. This is Hegel. Hegel, one of the great political philosophers, officially great in terms of his influence. A professor of mine in grad school used to say, in order to understand the philosophy, you need to know who his philosophical enemies are. Not only what he's for, but who and what he's against. In political philosophy, Hegel arguing against the Anglo-American tradition, right? The Lockean Jeffersonian principle that your life belongs to you. No. To Hegel, your life belongs to the state. He's argued against the principle of individual rights. You and I have one right and only one right, Hegel says, and that is to obey the state. Our only right is to serve the state. Well, a lot of American, socialists and their early intellectuals, were enamored of this, and they traveled to Germany, to Prussia, to authoritarian Prussia, to witness the way the German schools the German government schools indoctrinated German kids with the principle that your life belongs to the state, which is going to bear terrible fruit in the 20th century, isn't it? Those principles, give rise to both communism and National Socialism. But that's still in the future in the early 19th century. And they come back, these American intellectuals come back to the United States, they have contempt for the selfishness of the American, system, the individualism, and your life belongs to you and everything. And they want to Germanize, American culture. They want to teach that, that your life belongs to the state. In Germany, they still do take the kids away from the family. They don't want the idea that your life belongs to you or that your life belongs to the family. Your life belongs to the state. You see that story in Germany recently about the homeschoolers, where the parents were arrested and the children were taken away from them and sent to some undisclosed location where they're going to be put into the government schools. That's Germany, German culture all through. And these American intellectuals and educators wanted that in America. And for that, you needed government schools with compulsory education, with the kids, dragged into the schools and taught, that their life belongs to the American state in the way that German kids were taught that their lives belong to the German state. So this was the shady origin of government schools in this country. Now, you asked about the regressives. Well, 100 years later, in the early 20th century, Dewey and all those guys, his colleagues in the regressive movement, they was enamored of the Soviet Union, not surprisingly, as their colleagues 100 years earlier were enamored of Prussia and Germany. And they all went to Russia. This is during the Stalin era. And they were ecstatic about the Soviet schools. Soviet schools. Where children are taught that individualism is evil, egoism is evil, the triumph of the working class is what's important. Your life belongs to, you got to sacrifice yourself for the workers' revolution. And all of this communist, what's the technical word for this communist bullshit? In Brooklyn, it is, yeah. And they came back to the United States, and to them, this was the Sovietizing or the communizing of the American government schools was the ultimate purpose, to teach the American children, that they had to give up any egoistic conception and sacrifice themselves for society as a whole. Now, those ideas caught on in the American. But the point is it's broader than just Dewey and the regressives. It's the anti-mind philosophy that permeates the American government schools. I mean, Dewey was very open in one of his books. I think Ayn Rand quotes him in the Comprachicos, maybe. You know, why he preferred the look-say method of teaching reading to phonics. Not because he thought look-say was more effective way of teaching reading, but the exact opposite. It's a less effective method of teaching reading. He didn't want kids reading. He says this in so many words. You don't want kids reading in 6, 7, 8 years old. You know, you want them to struggle with it and learn only later, because learning to read when you're young encourages intellectual independence. And you don't want kids to be independent because there's no social benefit in that. You want them learning to be dependent on the state, and that they're going to be serving the state. So you want to slow down their intellectual, development. Now this is monstrously evil at a level much deeper than the communist politics, right? At the level of deliberately wanting to stunt the intellectual development of the child's mind for political purposes. Now this is monstrous. You get the idea. I don't want any more. I just ate. Other questions? We'll get back to selling books. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for putting your speech together. I've heard many of these stories before, but adding so many more and stringing them all together is just fantastic. And I can't wait to start looking at this and put it out there for people to watch. But one of the most profound things that you said was that America perhaps may be more of a gift to the Jewish people than Israel.
Much
I
more.
wondered if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I think if there's going to be a state of Israel, I think it should be established in Texas. Not in the Middle East. I mean, in the Middle East, you're surrounded by lunatics. You're surrounded by enemies. Have you noticed in the last 100 years, bigotry generally, in the United States, bigotry generally and Jew hatred included has moved across the political spectrum from the supporters of America, and to some degree capitalism, to the enemies of America and socialism, which is as it should be. Because if you support America, you should be an individualist and consequently not a bigot of any kind. Whereas if you're a supporter of socialism, then you're a collectivist. And one natural outgrowth of collectivism is, class warfare, the communist version, race warfare, the National Socialist version. Whether it's class against class or race against race, it's a natural outgrowth of a collectivist philosophy. You think in terms of individual, you think in terms of groups, not in terms of individuals. So notice it's the leftists who are the real bigots, in the country today. But aside from that, yeah, if you go to Texas, the conservative, they tend to support Israel as an ally against the jihadists. A lot of you've seen in the last 40 years or so, a lot of these conservative clergymen. Jerry Falwell was a good example during his lifetime. Doing this Christian, Jewish, outreach, this outreach to the Jewish community. The upholding of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the links between Judaism and Christianity, especially in the light of the attacks on, by jihadists on the, on Judaism and Christianity. So I think, Texas would be much more amenable to Israel today. But, and especially since Israel was founded by secular Jews, it wasn't founded by Orthodox Jews. The Orthodox Jews rejected it because it was done by man. It's got to be done by the Messiah. It's got to be done by God. Nevertheless, this bizarre idea amongst these secular Jews that the Jewish homeland, first of all, that the Jews required a homeland, a Jewish state, in order to protect themselves from their many enemies, is just false. The United States is the safest place to be a Jew. Not Israel. I guarantee you. It's much safer. I'm an atheist. My mom was a Jew. But, it's much safer to be a Jew in America than it is to be a Jew in Israel. And so you don't need a Jewish homeland. What you need is a system of individual rights. And then the second bizarre idea that this Jewish homeland should be in its traditional biblical location. You know, in a Middle East that had become completely dominated by Islam, you know, over the past 1,300 years, and you could guarantee that members of the Islamic community, not all Muslims obviously, but members of the Islamic community were gonna hate having this little Western state, you know, in the midst of a vast Arab Islamic world, and they were going to be dedicated to crushing it, which, with very few exceptions, they are. Now, why is America the greatest thing that ever happened to the Jews? Because if you're a persecuted minority, what you need is the principle of individual rights. Everybody needs the principle of individual rights. But the more persecuted an ethnic group has been, whether Jews or blacks or Chinese or whatever it is, the more persecuted an ethnic group has been, the more desperately it needs the principle of individual rights. Everybody needs it, but the persecuted minorities in particular. Now, the study of Jewish history is just off the charts persecution. It's horrible. Ghettos to pogroms to National Socialism. It just goes on and on and on. You know, the protocols of the Elders of Zion, you know, forgery on the part of the Tsar's secret police was upheld by the National Socialists, is upheld in Iran today. It's things are complete fraud, and, you know, and forgery doesn't matter. It lives its own ghastly existence. You need the principle of individual rights. What country has more than any other, whatever its flaws, what country more than any other country has upheld the principle of individual rights? At times, anyway, the United States of America. This is why the Jews can control the media in this country today. That's a joke. Let's go on. So laugh. This is going to be out. Yeah, that's right. This is going to be out on YouTube. As Bernstein said. Bernstein said the Jews control the media. Now, my mom's not alive anymore. If she were, I'd ask her, what's your role in this conspiracy of controlling the media? But I know practicing Jews, so I can ask them what, you know, if they'll acknowledge me. Anyway, that's just nonsense. It's irrational bigotry. I remember one student of mine once saying, he said in class, blandly, as if it was completely uncontroversial, he said, the Jews control the country. Everybody knows it. You can't say it, but everybody knows it. I said, what? So what? So what? I mean, this is when Bill Clinton was president, you know, and Congress was filled with various Christian denominations, and the wealthiest guys in the country, you know, people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and people like that. You know, what does that mean? What kind of facts do you have to support? But you see, in America, you can have cranks and quacks and crackpots and bigots, but if the principle of individual rights is upheld, then, you know, your persecuted minorities are protected from the cranks, the crackpots, and, you know, and the bigots. The principle of individual rights needs to be recognized. That's America did that, and this is why the history of Jews in America is this glorious history. I mean, Thomas Sowell, you guys know Thomas Sowell, right? The historian, economist. He's written like 20 books or more. One of my favorite. I got like a dozen of Thomas Sowell's books on my library. One of my favorites is Ethnic America, where he goes through the history of all these ethnic groups in the United States: the Irish and the Germans and the Italians and the Jews and the blacks and the Mexicans and the Japanese, etc. And he claims at the turn of the 20th century, the East European Jews coming from, you know, Poland and Russia and Ukraine, it's a hideous persecution, were the poorest immigrants in the history of this country. Oh, that's a big mouthful. Within 2 generations, you saw, early in the 20th century, Thomas Sowell points out, there was this huge Jewish population that settled in New York City. There was not a single Jewish kid that graduated from a high school, because they were so poor, they were working. They work in the sweatshops, you know, in the garment industry. 20 years later, all these Jewish kids had MDs, you know, and the stereotype of the Jewish doctor in America by the 1930s, you know, had begun. And so, yeah, the freedom of the American system enabled the Jews, maybe the greatest rags to riches story in all of history. is 2 generations from possibly the poorest immigrant group in American history to, per capita, one of the reasons why you get all this prejudice, per capita, the Jews are the wealthiest ethnic group in the country. The wealthiest guys in the country tend to be WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, English descent. But amongst the English, there's also a great deal of poverty. You go into, rural South, there's a great deal of poverty amongst the English, the descendants in this country. There's no poverty amongst the Jews anymore. It hasn't been for several generations, except for the philosophy professors, but they're a rare, it's a rare exception. So you can buy my book. But for the most part, there's always exceptions. But for the most part, there's no poverty amongst the Jews. You have in the United States. So it's the principle of religious freedom and the principle of individual rights more broadly that's made us protected this persecuted minority, enabled them to make all these advances in I mean look at what. I mean, Alyssa Rosenbaum comes here, now she's an atheist, of course, but I mean, she has freedom in the United States to write these great novels, to develop a great philosophy, fleeing from the communists. She comes to America. Where does Einstein go? Fleeing from National Socialism to America. Jonas Salk, the guy who cured polio. Do you realize that there's like 7 billion people in the world? You know how many Jews there are in the world? It's like, it's like 15 million is the number I've seen. 15 million out of 7 billion. The unbelievable outpouring of genius, especially in America, first in Germany, especially in America, this tiny portion of the human population. America made that possible. So this is about America, and any persecuted minority, whether it's blacks or Asians or whatever it is, American Jews have set the template. They've established a template on how to rise, out of poverty in a free country or relatively free country and into middle class affluence. The emphasis on education, and on career in fields, that require education. And this is the path upward and outward. But the country has to be free. Now we're descending into statism. The turn of the 20th century, when those poverty-stricken Jews arrived here, the country was free and made possible. Given the Jewish cultural emphasis on development of the mind, America was perfect. It was a perfect wedding. And then of course everybody benefits. Jonas Salk, Ayn Rand, Albert Einstein, the Hollywood film industry. All the American novelists. Bernard Malamud, Saul Bellow. There's I can't forget Woody Allen. Who may be a sick man and likes 15-year-old girls who like his stepdaughter, but he's also a comic genius. So everybody benefits in this. So that's part of what I would say on this. We've been here for a long time. Everybody's still looks like they're. Well, Kelly's falling asleep. Everybody else looks like. Make yourself at home, Kelly. Make yourself comfortable. All right. So I guess as there's no more questions, I guess I see a hand. Yeah.
How much credit do you give the Dutch for their contribution to the Enlightenment and development of human freedom?
The Dutch and the development of the Enlightenment. Who do you have in mind?
Well, Irish Revolution. Kings came over to England from Holland.
Okay, the question is how much credit do you give the Dutch, in generating the Enlightenment, and he points to the Glorious Revolution. Yeah, William and Mary of Orange were Dutch, but the Glorious Revolution was English. And the significance of the Glorious Revolution, the 1688. And the Enlightenment's often dated roughly from 1688 to 1789. But the significance of the Glorious Revolution is overthrowing the Stuart dynasty, right? The Stuarts were the ones, the traditional Scottish kings were the ones who tried to live out the divine right of kings theories, that God had given them this special power. And the English wanted no more wanted no more part of that, and they brought over monarchs who, the significance of William and Mary is that they were willing to accede to the English demand for greater recognition of individual rights. I mean, John Locke is writing his 2 treatises of civil government in that same decade, in the 1680s. Arguing that individuals have the unalienable right to life, liberty, and property, the right to their own life. So William and Mary were willing to rule as enlightened despots. The Dutch, well, 17th century. I mean, I think I'm sure there were Dutch. The Dutch made great advances in medicine at Leiden, the University of Leiden, which were brought over to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, by various alumni of Leiden. But so I mean, the Netherlands was an advanced country without a doubt. But I think overwhelmingly the Enlightenment is a British phenomenon, and I think it's not an accident, that you saw all these advances in applied science and technology and industrialization in Great Britain. I think what's his name? I mentioned it before, Arthur Herman's book, how the Scots invented the modern world is really good on this. And I don't know any equivalent book on how the Dutch invented the modern world, although maybe you could research and write it. Yes, I see a hand.
I watched the live stream.
That was fun.
That was fun to watch too. I was struck by his constant assertion that the Enlightenment, Renaissance, every philosophical and technological advancement that has benefited civilization was all brought about by Christianity. And it was almost impossible to refute because it was so absurd. You dealt with it fantastically, and I would just like to get a sense from you how you dealt with that in the moment.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But by the way, I'm going to write a book on this. The title is going to be Religion versus Man, and Christianity's going to get a chapter. I have an essay coming out in the winter issue of the Objective Standard, Religion versus Aristotle, which I think is going to be is really good on this. It shows how all the 3 major Middle Eastern religions, starting with the Jews, in fact, Craig Biddle and I have discussed. I may write an essay for TOS one day on Judaism, and it would begin by saying the Jews get blamed for everything they didn't do. And that which they should get blamed for, they get a pass. And the thing that they should get blamed for is that they set the template back in the 2nd century or the 3rd century BC for overtly rejecting the Greek approach. They rejected the Hellenizing Jews after Alexander the Great conquered that part of the world. Expelled or executed the Hellenizing Jews, the Maccabees, and Jews to this day celebrate as Hanukkah, this holiday, which is really a disaster, for human history, in the rejecting of the Greek commitment to reason in favor of the traditional Judaic commitment to faith. They set the template. The Christians then did it, and then the Muslims. So all 3 of the major Middle Eastern religions, in one form or another, have had to come to grips with the Greeks and with Aristotle. And my essay, Religion versus Aristotle, is exactly on that theme, and I'm really proud of it. But my book, Religion versus Man, will be broader than that. But to answer your question, it's going to take a whole book. I mean, the claim that all these advances in the modern world, are the result of Christianity is false. It's going to take a whole book, and you have to lay the foundations, and show what the Greeks contributed to Western civilization. I mean, my jaw dropped when D'Souza said in so many words, quote, "The Greeks contributed little or nothing to science," unquote. Yeah, especially a guy as intelligent and educated as Dinesh D'Souza is. And who's written, I think, excellent books on politics. I like your liberal education. I like what's so great about America. I like the end of racism. There's a number of his books on politics that I like. He's a very smart guy, very educated guy. The Greeks contribute little or nothing to science. I mean, well, anyway. So I pointed out quickly, Aristotle, the greatest biologist, one of the greatest biologists in history, and Archimedes, and Hippocrates, and Galen, and Ptolemy, and Hypatia, who was killed by the Christians, debate doesn't really interest me. You don't have enough time. You don't have enough time to make your case. All I want to do is write a book. And write a book on this. And anyway, debates, even on YouTube, eventually they'll be forgotten. But a good book could be around for a long time, and influence a lot of minds. I want to write a book, Religion versus Man. You got to lay the foundations, show what the Greeks contributed to, and Will Durant is great on this. Everything secular in our society comes from the Greeks, including philosophy, science, the arts, and then show how Christianity warred against, these principles, suppressed them, bringing about the Dark Ages, and how, during the medieval Renaissance, when people like Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus reintroduced them into Catholic Europe, from the Islamic world, it was during the golden age of Islam, the church banned, the reading and study of Aristotle. So, the truth is that the Greeks provided all these advances. The Christians provided the impediments. But that's, to make that historical case can definitely be done, but it involves a great deal of argumentation. You don't have time, in a 3-minute rebuttal in the midst of a debate. You need a whole book. You need a whole book to do that. Although I think my essay, Religion versus Aristotle, does a pretty good job in a condensed form. And I got this great quote from Durant. This is why Ayn Rand gives us the brilliant philosophy. Durant gave us a great work in history. Again, I strongly recommend this great quote from Durant of how when Aristotle's reintroduced into medieval Europe, it's what he calls it a Trojan horse, and ultimately the development of science and secular philosophy constitutes the triumph of Greek paganism over Christianity. And Durant is spot on accurate, with that, and it's a brilliant insight on his part. Go ahead.
Anybody wants to pay with cash rather than having it run your credit card, they need to know right now, otherwise they're going to start closing all the tabs.
They can pay cash to me.
And I think we've got the room to whenever, so
yeah, use and abuse me, I'm going to ask for a raise, boss. Overtime. I'm going to be union. To make this into a union job, we're going to start the Objectivist Speakers Union because we're exploited. We're exploited labor here. They go on and on for hours, and I don't get any extra remuneration. Except greedy freaking capitalists. So you get that on YouTube also. So, we got any more questions? Thank God the Montezuma's revenge has held off. Hey, better living through drugs. I got my Imodium right here. Stuff works. Damn right. No more questions. Well, I guess we can get to the more serious business of selling books. So, who wants the last book? All right. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.